Hi, I'm Sarah Martinez, and at the annual corporate retreat in front of 200 employees, my department head, Margaret Sinclair, stood at the podium and said, "Let's be realistic about career trajectories. Some people are meant to support from behind the scenes while looking directly at me, and everyone chuckled like they were in on some inside joke. What none of them knew was that I'd been quietly acquiring shares through a veteran business loan program for the past 3 years, and when the company founder took the microphone next and announced, "I'd like you all to meet your new majority owner," that's when Margaret realized the woman she'd been calling just a secretary was about to become her boss. The Cascade Resort in Portland sprawled across the mountainside like something out of a luxury magazine, all exposed timber beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Columbia River Gorge. Pine-scented air drifted through the conference center where Meridian Technologies held its annual 3-day retreat, complete with team-building exercises, strategic planning sessions, and enough networking events to make an introvert's head spin. I'd been coming to these retreats for 8 years now, always in the same capacity. Administrative support, note-taker, the person who made sure everyone's dietary restrictions were accommodated and the presentation equipment worked properly. This year felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the way I carried myself as I walked through the lobby in my crisp navy blazer and comfortable flats, or the calm confidence that had settled into my shoulders over the past few months. I'd learned to move through corporate spaces like I belonged there, even when whispers followed in my wake about the secretary who thinks she's management material. The morning session was already underway when I slipped into the back row of the main conference hall. Margaret Sinclair commanded the stage with her usual theatrical flair, gesturing broadly as she outlined the company's growth projections for the coming fiscal year. Her auburn hair was pulled into a perfect chignon, and her designer suit probably cost more than I used to make in a month when I first started at Meridian. She had that particular brand of corporate charisma that made people lean forward when she spoke, hanging on every carefully modulated word. "Innovation doesn't happen in isolation," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying easily across the room without the microphone. "It requires vision, strategic thinking, and the ability to see beyond the day-to-day operational details that can bog down even the most well-intentioned organizations." I pulled out my tablet, fingers moving across the screen as I took notes. Old habits die hard, even when you're not technically required to document every corporate pronouncement anymore. Around me, department heads and senior managers nodded sagely, some scribbling their own notes, others checking phones discreetly under the table. "That's why leadership development is so crucial," Margaret continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "We need to identify those individuals who have the capacity for strategic thinking, who can move beyond task-oriented work and embrace the bigger picture." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. I kept my expression neutral, though something twisted in my stomach. I'd heard variations of this speech before, usually delivered in smaller settings where the subtext was even clearer. Some people are cut out for leadership, and others aren't. The presentation shifted to organizational charts and promotion pathways, colorful slides that outlined clear trajectories from entry-level positions to executive roles. Margaret clicked through them methodically, pausing occasionally to elaborate on specific requirements or qualifications. MBA preferred. 5 years of management experience, minimum. Demonstrated leadership in high-stakes environments. Of course, she added with a practiced smile. We value every member of our team. Administrative professionals, support staff, and operational personnel are the backbone of any successful organization. But let's be realistic about career trajectories. And there it was, the moment when her eyes found mine in the back row, that split second of deliberate eye contact that transformed her general statement into something far more personal. The message was clear: know your place. "Some people are meant to support from behind the scenes," she said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone, warmer but somehow more condescending. "And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Excellence in support roles is just as valuable as excellence in leadership positions." The chuckle started somewhere in the middle section and rippled outward. Not malicious laughter, exactly, but the kind of uncomfortable amusement that happens when someone says something everyone's thinking but nobody wants to acknowledge directly. I felt heat creep up my neck, but I kept my fingers moving across the tablet screen, documenting Margaret's words with the same professional detachment I'd cultivated over years of similar moments. "Sarah Martinez, for example," Margaret said, and suddenly the entire room seemed to turn in slow motion. 8 years with the company, consistently reliable, always willing to take on additional administrative responsibilities. That's exactly the kind of dedicated support that allows our leadership team to focus on strategic initiatives. The spotlight wasn't literal, but it felt that way. 200 faces turning toward the back row, some curious, some sympathetic, a few openly amused. I could feel my cheeks burning, but I managed what I hoped was a gracious smile and a small nod of acknowledgement. What else could I do? Stand up and object? Storm out? That would only confirm what they already believed about people like me, that we were too emotional, too reactive, not built for the pressures of real leadership. "So when we talk about succession planning and leadership development," Margaret continued, mercifully moving her attention away from me, "we need to be honest about natural aptitudes and career ceilings. It's not about limiting anyone's potential. It's about recognizing where that potential can be best utilized." The session continued for another 20 minutes, covering budget allocations and performance metrics, and a dozen other topics that would have been fascinating under different circumstances. But I found myself only half listening, my mind replaying that moment of public categorization. 8 years of showing up early, staying late, learning every system and process in the company, and this is how I was perceived: as a fixture, reliable and pleasant, and permanently fixed in place. During the coffee break, clusters of employees gathered around high-top tables scattered throughout the lobby. I filled my cup with dark roast and found a spot near the windows, watching clouds drift across the mountain peaks while conversations swirled around me. Fragments of discussion reached my ears: quarterly projections, client presentations, weekend plans. "Sarah, right?" a voice interrupted my mountain gazing. I turned to find Tom Chen, one of the newer product managers, approaching with his own coffee cup. "That was quite the shout-out Margaret gave you up there." His tone was friendly but careful, the way people speak when they're not sure if they're supposed to acknowledge what just happened. I appreciated the effort, even if the conversation was inevitably going to be awkward. "She's not wrong," I said with a shrug. "Administrative work is important." "Sure, but—" Tom paused, clearly weighing his words. "I mean, you basically run half the operational side of things. Everyone knows that. The way Margaret made it sound, you're just answering phones and filing papers." I took a sip of coffee, using the moment to consider my response. Tom wasn't wrong. My role had evolved significantly over the years, expanding far beyond the original job description. I'd redesigned workflow systems, managed vendor relationships, and coordinated cross-departmental projects that most people never realized required coordination. But pointing that out would sound defensive, and defensive wasn't a good look in corporate settings. "People see what they expect to see," I said finally. "Sometimes that works in your favor. Sometimes it doesn't." Tom nodded slowly, something thoughtful crossing his expression. That's probably the most diplomatic way I've ever heard someone describe getting publicly dismissed. Before I could respond, the chime sounded for the next session. People began drifting back toward the conference hall, coffee cups abandoned on tables as conversations wrapped up. Tom gave me an encouraging smile before heading back inside, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the mountain view. I lingered for a few extra minutes, watching the last stragglers file through the double doors. The coffee was still warm in my hands, and the afternoon light streaming through the windows had that particular quality that makes everything look softer around the edges. In a few hours, there would be another session, then dinner, then evening networking events where people would cluster into familiar groups and rehash the day's presentations over wine and carefully plated appetizers. But first, I had a phone call to make. I pulled out my personal cell phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. The call connected to the second ring. "Martinez calling," I said quietly, moving closer to the windows where the background noise was minimal. "Yes, the papers are ready for signing. Tomorrow morning works perfectly." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but by the time I hung up, something had shifted in my chest. Not anger exactly, and not vindication either. Just a quiet sense of completion, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. I finished my coffee, straightened my blazer, and walked back toward the conference hall. The afternoon session was about to begin, and I had notes to take. Tomorrow would be different, but today I was still exactly what everyone expected me to be: reliable, efficient, and mostly invisible. The mountain peaks outside remained unchanged, eternal and patient, as the clouds that drifted across them. Some things take time to reveal their true nature, I reflected as I found my seat in the back row. Sometimes the most dramatic transformations happen so slowly that nobody notices until it's far too late to stop them. Margaret Sinclair's corner office occupied prime real estate on the 15th floor of Meridian Technologies' downtown Portland headquarters, with panoramic views of the Willamette River and enough square footage to host small conferences. The space reflected her personality perfectly. Sleek glass desk, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars, and a seating area arranged with the precision of a magazine photo shoot. Everything had its place, and Margaret's place was clearly at the center of it all. She held court from behind that imposing desk like a queen receiving subjects, her daily schedule packed with back-to-back meetings that reinforced her status as the company's unofficial second-in-command. Senior managers sought her approval before making major decisions. Junior staff members waited weeks for 10-minute appointments on her calendar. Even the company's founder, Harold Winters, seemed to defer to her judgment on operational matters more often than not. The morning after the retreat, Margaret arrived at the office with her usual commanding presence, designer heels clicking against the polished concrete floors as she made her way through the open workspace. Conversations paused as she passed, employees glancing up from their monitors with the kind of respectful attention reserved for visiting dignitaries. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power she wielded and wasn't shy about using it. "Good morning, Margaret," called Jessica from the marketing department, looking up hopefully from her desk. "Did you have a chance to review the campaign proposal I sent over?" Margaret paused just long enough to acknowledge the question without breaking stride. "I'll get to it when I can, Jessica. Priority items first." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Jessica's face fell slightly, but she managed a professional smile and returned to her computer screen. This was how Margaret operated. Everything filtered through her priorities, her timeline, her assessment of what deserved her attention. It was a masterclass in corporate hierarchy, executed with the kind of subtle precision that left people feeling grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they received. Her assistant, Rachel, was already waiting with the day's schedule when Margaret reached her office. Coffee steaming in a ceramic mug that had been warmed beforehand, messages arranged in order of importance, calendar color-coded to reflect the significance of each appointment. Rachel had learned Margaret's preferences through trial and error over the past 2 years, adjusting her approach until she could anticipate needs before they were voiced. "The Henderson Industries proposal needs your signature by noon," Rachel said, following Margaret into the office with her tablet in hand. "Legal has already reviewed the contract terms, and finance approved the budget allocation." Margaret settled into her chair, immediately pulling up her email with practiced efficiency. "What about the staffing requests from operations? Those are in the red folder on your desk. David from operations called twice yesterday asking about a timeline for approval." Rachel hesitated slightly before adding, "He seemed pretty stressed about the deadline." "David's always stressed about something," Margaret said without looking up from her screen. "If it were truly urgent, Harold would have escalated it directly to me." The casual mention of the company founder by his first name wasn't accidental. Margaret had cultivated that relationship carefully over her 5 years with Meridian, positioning herself as Harold's trusted advisor and operational right hand. He might own the company, but she ran it day to day, and everyone understood that distinction. Harold focused on big-picture strategy and investor relations, while Margaret handled the practical business of managing 300 employees and a dozen major accounts. "Should I reschedule the 2 o'clock with procurement?" Rachel asked, scrolling through the afternoon appointments. They're requesting an additional 30 minutes to present the vendor analysis. Margaret's fingers paused over her keyboard. Procurement meetings were necessary but tedious, full of spreadsheets and cost comparisons that required her to make decisions she could easily delegate to someone else. But delegation meant giving up control, and control was what kept her indispensable. Keep it at 30 minutes, she decided. If they can't make their case in half an hour, they don't have a case worth making. Through the glass walls of her office, Margaret could see the main workspace spreading out below, like a carefully orchestrated performance. Customer service representatives fielding calls with practiced professionalism. Project managers huddled around conference tables with laptops and coffee cups. Software developers typing code with the focused intensity of people who understood that their work had a direct impact on the company's bottom line. And there, at a desk near the far corner, Sarah Martinez was settling into her morning routine. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Sarah did. Organizing files, checking emails, preparing for whatever administrative tasks the day would bring. 8 years of the same reliable competence, never missing deadlines, never causing drama, never pushing for more than she'd been given. Margaret felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt about yesterday's public comment, but she pushed it aside. Leadership required making difficult decisions, including decisions about human resources and career development. Sarah was good at her job, excellent even, but excellence in administration didn't automatically translate to potential for strategic leadership. Margaret had seen too many companies suffer because they promoted people beyond their natural capabilities, creating inefficiency and resentment, when reality failed to match good intentions. "Mrs. Sinclair," Rachel's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Harold's assistant just called. He wants to see you in his office at 10:30. Said it was regarding the quarterly board presentation." Margaret nodded, already shifting her mental focus to the strategic elements of next week's board meeting. Harold valued her input on these presentations, particularly her ability to translate complex operational data into clear, compelling narratives that resonated with board members who might not understand the technical details but needed to understand the business impact. The rest of the morning passed in its familiar rhythm of meetings and decisions, and small exercises of authority that reinforced Margaret's position in the company hierarchy. She approved budget allocations, rejected staffing requests that didn't meet her criteria, and reviewed project timelines with the kind of detailed attention that kept operations running smoothly. Her door remained open to senior staff but effectively closed to anyone below a certain level, a boundary enforced by Rachel's careful calendar management. At 10:20, Margaret gathered her materials for the meeting with Harold and made her way to the executive suite on the 20th floor. The elevator ride gave her a few moments to review her notes and consider the key points she wanted to emphasize about Q3 performance metrics. Harold appreciated thoroughness, but he also valued conciseness, the ability to distill complex information into actionable insights. Harold Winter's office was a study in understated elegance, furnished with antiques that spoke to old money and established success. The man himself was in his mid-60s, with silver hair and kind of quiet authority that came from building a company from scratch over 30 years. He'd started Meridian Technologies in his garage with 2 employees and a revolutionary idea about data management software. Now the company employed hundreds of people and generated annual revenue in the 9-figure range. "Margaret, come in," he said, looking up from the financial report spread across his mahogany desk. "I wanted to discuss the board presentation, but first I need to talk to you about something else." His tone was different than usual, not unfriendly, but more formal, as if this were a business meeting rather than a strategic consultation between trusted colleagues. Margaret took her usual seat in the leather chair across from his desk, setting her tablet and notes on the side table within easy reach. "Of course, Harold. What's on your mind?" Harold leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about succession planning and organizational structure. The board has been asking questions about sustainability and long-term leadership development." Margaret felt her pulse quicken slightly. Succession planning conversations usually led to good news for someone in her position: more responsibility, expanded authority, possibly even a path to eventual ownership stake in the company. She'd been preparing for this discussion for months, building a case for why she was the logical choice to eventually take over operational leadership when Harold decided to step back. "That's smart strategic thinking," she said carefully. "The board should be confident about leadership continuity." "Exactly. Which is why I've been reviewing organizational charts and performance metrics going back several years, looking at who's really driving results versus who's getting credit for them." Harold picked up a manila folder from his desk and opened it slowly. Some interesting patterns emerged. Margaret maintained her professional composure, but something in Harold's tone was setting off warning bells in the back of her mind. This didn't sound like the beginning of a promotion conversation. It sounded like something else entirely. "I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those patterns," she said, keeping her voice level. Harold pulled out a sheet of paper, what looked like a detailed organizational chart with notes written in the margins. "Take the operations efficiency improvements we implemented last year. Significant cost savings, better workflow, improved customer satisfaction scores. Do you remember who initially proposed those changes?" Margaret's mind raced through the timeline of last year's operational overhaul. She'd presented the final recommendations to the executive team and overseen their implementation, receiving considerable praise for the results. But the original proposals had come from several sources, different departments contributing ideas. It was hard to remember every detail. "That was a collaborative effort," she said diplomatically. "Multiple departments working together to identify improvement opportunities." Collaborative, yes, but the initial framework came from someone very specific. Harold flipped to another page in the folder. Sarah Martinez submitted a comprehensive analysis to operations in February of last year. Detailed recommendations for workflow optimization, vendor consolidation, and customer service integration. Somehow, that analysis never made it to the executive level directly. The words hit Margaret like cold water. She remembered now, Sarah had submitted some kind of operational report through proper channels, but it had seemed like typical administrative input rather than strategic thinking. Margaret had incorporated some of those suggestions into her own broader recommendations without really considering where they'd originated. "Sarah's always been thorough in her administrative support," Margaret said carefully. Harold's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp with the kind of focused attention that made Margaret suddenly very aware of every word she chose. Administrative support. That's an interesting way to describe what amounts to strategic operational analysis. Before Margaret could respond, Harold's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and picked up immediately. "Yes, send her up," he said into the phone. Then, looking at Margaret, "I've asked Sarah to join us for this conversation. I think it's time we had a more comprehensive discussion about roles and responsibilities around here." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Sarah Martinez stepped into the executive suite carrying a single manila folder and wearing the same calm expression she brought to every professional interaction. Her navy blazer was pressed, her posture straight but relaxed, and she moved through the plush hallway with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Margaret watched through Harold's office doorway as Sarah approached, and for the first time in years, felt genuinely uncertain about what was about to happen. "Sarah, thank you for coming up," Harold said, rising from his chair as she entered the office. The gesture was small but significant. Harold rarely stood for anyone below senior management level, and Margaret noticed the courtesy with a growing sense of unease. "Please, have a seat." Sarah settled into the chair beside Margaret's, placing her folder on her lap with careful precision. She nodded politely to Margaret, the kind of professional acknowledgement that revealed nothing about her thoughts or feelings regarding yesterday's public categorization. If she was nervous about being summoned to the executive suite, it didn't show. If she was curious about why she'd been included in what was clearly a high-level strategic discussion, her expression gave no indication. "I was just telling Margaret about some interesting patterns I've discovered while reviewing organizational performance," Harold continued, settling back into his chair. "Particularly regarding the source of various operational improvements over the past few years." Margaret felt her mouth go slightly dry. The conversation was heading somewhere she couldn't control, and control had been her primary tool for managing corporate relationships since the day she'd arrived at Meridian. She glanced sideways at Sarah, searching for some clue about what the other woman might know or suspect, but Sarah's attention was focused entirely on Harold. "Sarah, I'd like you to walk us through the operational analysis you submitted in February of last year," Harold said. "The one regarding workflow optimization and customer service integration." Without hesitation, Sarah opened her folder and removed a document that Margaret recognized with an uncomfortable jolt of memory. It was the report she'd dismissed as routine administrative input, the one she'd barely glanced at before incorporating its recommendations into her own executive presentation. The analysis identified 3 primary inefficiencies in our current operational structure, Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. First, redundant approval processes that were creating bottlenecks in project completion. Second, inadequate communication protocols between customer service and technical support teams. Third, vendor management practices that were inflating costs without delivering proportional value. Margaret listened with growing awareness that this wasn't the kind of surface-level observation that came from simply processing paperwork and scheduling meetings. This was strategic thinking, the kind of comprehensive analysis that required deep understanding of business operations and the ability to identify systemic problems that others had missed. The workflow optimization recommendations included streamlining the approval hierarchy for routine decisions, implementing cross-training protocols to reduce dependency on individual team members, and establishing automated escalation procedures for customer issues that exceeded standard resolution timeframes. Sarah continued, referencing her notes with the ease of someone who understood every detail of what she was presenting. Harold nodded, occasionally making notes on his own copy of the document. Margaret remained silent, her mind racing through the implications of what she was hearing. She'd presented these exact recommendations to the executive team 8 months ago, receiving considerable praise for her strategic insight and operational expertise. The improvements had resulted in measurable cost savings and improved customer satisfaction scores that had impressed the board of directors. "What about the vendor consolidation proposal?" Harold asked. "That initiative alone saved the company nearly $200,000 in the first quarter after implementation." Sarah flipped to another section of her report. The analysis showed we were working with 47 different vendors for services that could be consolidated under 12 primary contracts. Many of the existing relationships were legacy arrangements that hadn't been reviewed for cost efficiency in several years. The consolidation strategy prioritized vendors who could provide multiple services while maintaining quality standards. Margaret felt heat creeping up her neck as the full scope of Sarah's contributions became clear. This wasn't administrative support or clerical assistance. This was the kind of comprehensive business analysis that formed the foundation of executive decision-making. And somehow, Margaret had managed to convince herself and others that these insights had originated from her own strategic thinking. "I'm curious, Sarah," Harold said, leaning forward slightly. "How long did this analysis take you to complete?" "Approximately 6 months of data collection and analysis, working primarily during off hours so it wouldn't interfere with my regular responsibilities," Sarah replied. "I wanted to ensure the recommendations were based on comprehensive information rather than assumptions." 6 months. Margaret's mind reeled at the implications. While she'd been focused on managing her public profile and positioning herself for advancement, Sarah had been conducting the kind of detailed operational research that most consulting firms would charge hundreds of thousands of dollars to complete. And she'd done it quietly, without fanfare or recognition, apparently motivated by nothing more than a desire to improve the company's performance. "Why didn't you present this directly to the executive team?" Harold asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge, though his tone remained conversational. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught something in her eyes, a flicker of awareness that this question had implications beyond simple curiosity. "I followed standard protocols for submitting operational recommendations. The report was filed with operations management for review and potential escalation to executive level if deemed appropriate." The answer was diplomatically perfect, revealing nothing about what Sarah might think or know about how her work had been handled after submission. But Margaret understood the subtext. Sarah had done everything correctly, following proper channels and organizational hierarchy. It wasn't her fault that her recommendations had been absorbed into someone else's presentation without proper attribution. Harold set down his pen and looked directly at Margaret. I think this raises some important questions about how we identify and develop strategic talent within the organization. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her carefully constructed professional identity. Everything she'd built at Meridian, her reputation for strategic thinking, her position as Harold's trusted operational advisor, her assumption that she was the natural choice for succession planning, suddenly felt far less solid than it had an hour ago. Strategic talent can emerge from unexpected places, she said carefully, trying to find a response that acknowledged Sarah's contributions without diminishing her own value to the organization. Indeed it can, Harold agreed, which brings me to the real reason I asked you both here today. He opened another folder, this one containing documents that Margaret didn't recognize. Legal papers, from the look of them, with official seals and signatures that suggested something far more significant than routine corporate business. Sarah, I understand you've been working with veteran business loan programs and investment advisors over the past few years, Harold said. Building quite an impressive portfolio from what I've heard. Margaret's confusion deepened. What did Sarah's personal financial affairs have to do with operational analysis and strategic talent development? But Sarah's response suggested this wasn't an unexpected topic of conversation. Yes, sir. The SBA veteran loan programs provided opportunities for investment and business development that weren't available through traditional financing channels, Sarah said. I've been working with financial advisors to diversify holdings and build long-term wealth. Harold smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Margaret had seen from him all morning. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking and long-term planning that impressed me when your attorney reached out last month. Margaret felt like she was listening to a conversation in a foreign language. Sarah had an attorney. Sarah was working with investment advisors. Sarah was building wealth through strategic financial planning. None of this aligned with Margaret's understanding of who Sarah Martinez was or what she was capable of accomplishing. I have to admit, when James Morrison first contacted me about your interest in acquiring additional ownership stake in Meridian Technologies, I was skeptical, Harold continued. But after reviewing your operational contributions and financial qualifications, I realized I'd been overlooking someone who'd been contributing at an executive level for years without receiving appropriate recognition or compensation. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Ownership stake. Sarah Martinez, the woman she'd publicly categorized as permanent administrative support just yesterday, had been negotiating to buy shares in the company. And Harold, the founder and majority owner, was speaking about these negotiations as if they were not only legitimate but welcome. Sarah remained composed throughout Harold's revelation, but Margaret caught a subtle change in her posture, a slight straightening of her shoulders that suggested relief at no longer having to maintain whatever careful balance she'd been striking between her public role and her private ambitions. The paperwork should be finalized within the next few days, Harold said, looking directly at Sarah. At which point, you'll own 43% of Meridian Technologies, making you the largest minority shareholder and giving you significant influence over strategic direction and operational decisions. Margaret's world tilted sideways. 43%. Sarah Martinez, who'd been dismissed as, quote, just a secretary by people who'd never bothered to look beyond her job title, was about to become one of the most powerful people in the company. More powerful than Margaret herself, whose own stock options amounted to less than 5% of total ownership. Harold's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen before answering. Yes, send them up immediately. The contracts are ready for signature. Sarah sat perfectly still in her chair, hands folded over the manila folder in her lap, watching Harold's revelations settle into the room like dust after an explosion. The silence stretched for exactly 7 seconds. She'd learned to count them during her military service, when timing could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. 7 seconds was long enough for Margaret's face to cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching panic before settling into a carefully controlled mask of professional composure. But Sarah had seen that look before, in boardrooms and barracks alike. It was the expression of someone realizing that the game they thought they were playing had different rules than they'd understood. Margaret's carefully manicured fingers gripped the arms of her leather chair just slightly too tight, and her breathing had shifted to the shallow rhythm of someone fighting to maintain control. I think there's been some misunderstanding, Margaret said finally, her voice carrying the forced calm of someone buying time to process impossible information. Sarah's contributions to operational efficiency are certainly valuable, but ownership stake discussions seem premature given her current role and experience level. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly, the kind of subtle expression that suggested he found Margaret's response both predictable and disappointing. Sarah remained silent, recognizing this moment for what it was. Not her cue to defend herself, but Margaret's opportunity to reveal exactly how little she understood about the situation unfolding around her. Current role, Harold repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting phrase, Margaret. Because according to my records, Sarah's current role has evolved significantly beyond her original job description. She's been managing vendor relationships, optimizing operational workflows, and conducting strategic analyses that have saved this company considerable money and improved our competitive position. Sarah could feel Margaret's sideways glance, a quick assessment that carried the weight of 8 years of assumptions being rapidly recalibrated. She didn't meet Margaret's eyes, instead maintaining her focus on Harold, with the patient attention she'd learned during briefings where lives depended on understanding every detail correctly. Moreover, Harold continued, reaching for another document from his desk, Sarah's experience level includes 8 years of active duty in the Army Corps of Engineers, where she managed logistics operations for overseas deployments and supervised teams responsible for multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects. Her service record includes commendations for strategic planning and operational excellence under pressure. The words landed in the room like carefully placed charges, each detail exploding another of Margaret's assumptions about who Sarah was and what she was capable of accomplishing. Sarah had never hidden her military background, but she'd learned early in her corporate career that mentioning combat experience and leadership roles in overseas operations sometimes made civilian colleagues uncomfortable. It was easier to let people see what they expected to see, a quiet administrative professional rather than a veteran who'd coordinated supply chains in hostile territory. I wasn't aware of the full scope of Sarah's military experience, Margaret said, and Sarah heard the subtle shift in her tone. Less dismissive now, more cautious, like someone navigating unfamiliar terrain where the ground might shift without warning. That's unfortunate, Harold replied, because that experience is exactly why I'm confident in this ownership transfer. Sarah understands operational complexity, strategic resource allocation, and long-term planning in ways that many civilian business professionals never develop. A soft knock at the office door interrupted the conversation. Harold's assistant peered in with the kind of deferential expression reserved for moments when important business was clearly in progress. Mr. Winters? The attorneys are here with the final documents. Send them in, Harold said immediately. We're ready to proceed. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, not from nervousness but from the familiar rush of a long-planned operation finally reaching its execution phase. She'd been working toward this moment for 3 years, ever since the day she'd realized that her operational insights were being consistently absorbed into other people's presentations without acknowledgement. The decision to pursue ownership rather than recognition had been strategic. She'd learned in the military that sometimes the most effective power was the kind that others didn't see coming. 2 attorneys entered the office carrying briefcases, and the kind of purposeful demeanor that suggested significant legal business was about to be concluded. Sarah recognized James Morrison, the veteran business advocate who'd helped her navigate the complex process of securing financing and structuring the ownership transfer. The second attorney was someone she hadn't met before, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Sarah, Margaret, I'd like you to meet Catherine Walsh from Hendricks, Walsh & Associates, Harold said, rising to greet the new arrivals. Catherine has been handling the legal structure of the ownership transfer and will be overseeing the documentation process. Margaret's composure cracked just slightly. Harold, I think we should discuss this privately before moving forward with any legal proceedings. There are strategic implications that need careful consideration. The suggestion hung in the air like a desperate lifeline thrown toward a ship that had already sailed beyond rescue range. Harold's expression remained polite but firm, the look of someone who'd already made his decision and was committed to seeing it through. The strategic implications have been carefully considered over the past several months, he said. Catherine's team has conducted thorough due diligence on Sarah's qualifications, financial capacity, and vision for the company's future direction. Everything has been reviewed and approved. James Morrison opened his briefcase and began arranging documents on Harold's conference table, with the methodical precision of someone who'd orchestrated dozens of similar transactions. Sarah recognized some of the paperwork, loan documentation, financial statements, incorporation filings that had taken months to prepare and review. The ownership transfer structure is relatively straightforward, Catherine explained, addressing the room with professional authority. Ms. Martinez has secured financing through the SBA Veteran Business Loan Program, supplemented by private investment capital and personal assets accumulated over the past several years. The transaction will result in a 43% ownership stake, making her the largest minority shareholder with significant influence over operational and strategic decisions. Margaret's hands were now visibly trembling, though she was making an effort to conceal it by clasping them tightly in her lap. Sarah finally allowed herself to look directly at her former supervisor. She realized with quiet satisfaction and saw the exact moment when the full implications became clear. "This means she'll have authority over personnel decisions," Margaret said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they might somehow be less devastating when spoken aloud. "Among other responsibilities, yes," Catherine confirmed. "The ownership structure includes voting rights on executive appointments, budget allocations, and strategic planning initiatives." Sarah opened her manila folder and removed a single sheet of paper. Her formal resignation from her current administrative position, effective immediately upon completion of the ownership transfer. She'd drafted it 3 weeks ago, after the final financing had been approved, and she'd known with certainty that this day would arrive exactly as planned. Harold noticed the document in her hands and smiled with genuine warmth. "I don't think you'll be needing that resignation letter after all, Sarah. We'll simply be updating your job description instead." The documents spread across Harold's conference table represented more than just a business transaction. They were the physical manifestation of 3 years of calculated preparation, patient planning, and strategic positioning that nobody else in the room had seen coming. Sarah rose from her chair with the controlled movement of someone who'd trained for high-pressure situations, walking to the table where Catherine Walsh was arranging signature pages with methodical precision. Margaret remained frozen in her seat, watching as Sarah picked up the Mont Blanc pen Harold offered and signed her name with steady strokes across document after document. Each signature transformed theoretical possibility into legal reality, shifting the fundamental power structure of Meridian Technologies in ways that would ripple through every department, every decision, every relationship within the company. "The financing structure is particularly elegant," James Morrison explained as Sarah continued signing. "The SBA Veteran Loan Program provided the foundation, but Ms. Martinez supplemented that with strategic investments she's been building since her discharge from military service. Real estate holdings, technology stock portfolios, and a consulting business she's been operating quietly for the past 4 years." A consulting business. Margaret's mind struggled to process this additional revelation. Sarah Martinez, the woman she'd publicly categorized as permanent support staff just 24 hours ago, had been running her own business while maintaining her full-time position at Meridian. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. How had someone managed such complex professional activities while appearing to be nothing more than a reliable administrative employee? "What kind of consulting?" Harold asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was asking for Margaret's benefit rather than his own curiosity. "Operational efficiency analysis for mid-sized technology companies," Sarah replied without looking up from the documents. "Mostly West Coast firms looking to streamline workflows and reduce operational costs. The work was always conducted during evenings and weekends, and I was careful to ensure no conflicts of interest with my responsibilities here at Meridian." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. The implications were staggering. Sarah had been developing expertise in exactly the kind of strategic operational analysis that Margaret prided herself on, but doing it across multiple companies and building a reputation in the broader business community. While Margaret had been focused on climbing the corporate ladder within Meridian, Sarah had been building external credibility and financial resources that made her completely independent of traditional advancement pathways. The consulting work also provided valuable perspective on industry best practices, Sarah continued, finally looking up from the signature pages. Working with multiple companies allowed me to identify patterns and solutions that might not be obvious from within a single organizational structure. Catherine Walsh collected the signed documents with the satisfied efficiency of someone completing a complex transaction that had required months of preparation. That concludes the ownership transfer process. Ms. Martinez is now officially the largest minority shareholder of Meridian Technologies, with all associated rights and responsibilities. The words hung in the air like a gavel falling, making everything official and irreversible. Sarah Martinez was no longer an administrative employee, hoping for recognition or advancement. She was now Margaret's superior in the corporate hierarchy, with the legal authority to make decisions about personnel, budgets, and strategic direction. Harold stood and extended his hand to Sarah with a broad smile. "Welcome to executive leadership, Sarah. I'm looking forward to working with you in this new capacity." The handshake lasted several seconds, long enough for Margaret to fully absorb the reality that the company's founder was treating Sarah as an equal partner rather than a promoted employee. This wasn't a typical advancement scenario where someone moved up gradually through management ranks. This was a fundamental shift in organizational power accomplished through financial investment rather than traditional corporate politics. "I'd like to schedule a comprehensive operational review for next week," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new note of authority that Margaret had never heard before. "There are several efficiency improvements we should implement immediately, and I want to assess our current vendor relationships for potential consolidation opportunities." Margaret recognized those topics immediately. They were the same operational issues she'd been managing, or thought she'd been managing for the past several years. But now they would be Sarah's responsibility, with Sarah making the final decisions about implementations and resource allocations that Margaret had previously controlled. "Absolutely," Harold agreed. "I'll have Rachel clear my calendar for whatever time you need. And Margaret, I'd like you to work closely with Sarah on the transition process. Your institutional knowledge will be valuable as she settles into her new role." The suggestion was phrased politely, but Margaret understood it was actually a directive. She was being asked to help facilitate her own reduction in authority, to assist in transferring responsibilities she'd spent years accumulating to someone who had just become her organizational superior through a financial transaction she'd never seen coming. "Of course," Margaret managed, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I'm happy to help however I can." Sarah finally turned to look directly at Margaret, and for the first time since entering Harold's office, her expression showed something approaching warmth. Not sympathy, exactly, but acknowledgement of the difficulty of the situation, and perhaps respect for Margaret's professional composure under extraordinarily challenging circumstances. "I appreciate that, Margaret. Your experience with executive-level operations will be invaluable during the transition period. I'd also like to discuss some new initiatives I'm considering, strategic partnerships and expansion opportunities that could benefit from your perspective." The offer was generous, possibly even genuine, but Margaret heard the underlying message clearly. Sarah was offering her a role in the new organizational structure, but it would be a subordinate role, working on initiatives that Sarah would define and direct. The days of Margaret setting strategic priorities and making autonomous decisions were ending, replaced by a future where she would implement someone else's vision. "I'd be interested in hearing about those initiatives," Margaret replied, managing to inject some professional enthusiasm into her voice despite the churning in her stomach. James Morrison closed his briefcase with a satisfied snap, the sound marking the conclusion of business that had fundamentally altered the trajectory of multiple careers. "Ms. Martinez, you should receive copies of all finalized documents within 48 hours. If you have any questions about the legal aspects of your new responsibilities, don't hesitate to contact our office." As the attorneys prepared to leave, Harold walked them to the door with the kind of cordial efficiency that suggested this had been a positive conclusion to complex negotiations. Sarah remained at the conference table, organizing her copies of the signed documents with the same methodical attention to detail she'd always brought to administrative tasks. Margaret sat alone in her chair, watching as Sarah Martinez, combat veteran, business owner, strategic analyst, and now majority stakeholder, carefully placed legal documents into her manila folder. The woman she'd dismissed as permanently relegated to support functions was now positioned to shape the future direction of Meridian Technologies in ways that Margaret could only begin to imagine. The elevator descended in silence that felt thicker than the Portland fog rolling in from the Columbia River. Margaret stood beside Sarah, both women staring at the brushed steel doors as floor numbers counted down from 20 to 15 to 10, each digit marking their return to the operational world where everything had just changed in ways that most employees wouldn't understand for days or weeks to come. When the doors opened onto the main workspace, the familiar sounds of a busy technology company greeted them. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations flowing between cubicles and conference rooms. But Margaret felt like she was seeing it all through different eyes now, as if someone had adjusted the lighting to reveal details that had been hidden before. The same people doing the same jobs, but with a power structure that had fundamentally shifted during a 30-minute meeting in Harold's office. Sarah stepped out first, her manila folder tucked under her arm and her expression unchanged from the professional composure she'd maintained throughout the morning's revelations. She moved through the workspace with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her presence at Meridian for 8 years. But Margaret noticed something different in how people responded to her. Subtle shifts in body language, slightly longer eye contact, the kind of unconscious adjustments that suggested some employees had already begun to sense that Sarah Martinez was no longer the same person who'd left for the executive suite an hour ago. "Sarah," called David from operations, rising from his desk as she passed. "Do you have a minute? I wanted to follow up on that workflow analysis you suggested last month." Margaret felt her step falter slightly. Workflow analysis? She'd been managing operational initiatives for years, and David had never mentioned receiving suggestions from Sarah. But there he was, approaching her with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for department heads and senior managers. "Of course, David. I'd be happy to discuss implementation strategies," Sarah replied, pausing near his workspace. "Why don't you schedule some time on my calendar for this afternoon? We can review the timeline and resource requirements in detail." My calendar. Not a request to fit into David's schedule or work around other priorities, but an expectation that he would adapt to her availability. Margaret watched the interaction with growing awareness that these weren't the dynamics of an administrative employee being consulted on operational matters. This was how conversations happened between people who understood that one of them had decision-making authority and the other needed approval for implementation. "Absolutely," David said, already reaching for his phone to check scheduling options. "I've been hoping we could move forward with those recommendations. They could save us significant time and resources." Margaret continued walking toward her office, but her mind was replaying every interaction she'd observed between Sarah and other employees over the past several months. How many conversations had she dismissed as routine administrative coordination when they were actually strategic consultations? How many times had Sarah been quietly solving operational problems while Margaret remained focused on higher-level presentations and executive meetings? At her desk, Margaret's assistant Rachel was waiting with the afternoon's schedule and a stack of messages that suddenly felt far less urgent than they had that morning. Budget approval requests, vendor negotiations, personnel decisions, all responsibilities that might soon fall under Sarah's authority rather than her own. "How did the meeting with Harold go?" Rachel asked, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk with her tablet ready for note-taking. Margaret paused, considering how to answer a question that couldn't be fully explained without revealing information that would ripple through the company's informal communication networks within hours. "There were some organizational changes discussed. We'll need to adjust our approach to certain operational matters." The response was deliberately vague, but Rachel's expression suggested she sensed the weight of whatever had transpired in the executive suite. "Should I reschedule any of this afternoon's appointments?" "Not yet," Margaret said, though she wasn't certain that was the right answer. Everything felt provisional now, as if decisions she'd been making autonomously for years might now require consultation or approval from someone whose authority she was still struggling to fully comprehend. Through her office window, Margaret could see Sarah moving through the workspace with purposeful direction, stopping occasionally to speak with employees from different departments. Each conversation lasted only a few minutes, but Margaret noticed that people leaned in when Sarah spoke, giving her the kind of focused attention that suggested these weren't casual exchanges about administrative matters. Tom Chen from product management approached Sarah near the coffee station, and Margaret watched as they engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion about technical specifications or project timelines. Sarah listened intently, asked questions that made Tom pull out his phone to reference specific data, and nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from genuine technical competence rather than polite professional interest. Margaret realized with uncomfortable clarity that she'd been observing these interactions for months without really seeing them. She'd assumed Sarah was simply being helpful, offering administrative support to colleagues who needed assistance with routine matters. But the evidence was mounting that Sarah had been functioning as an informal advisor and strategic consultant across multiple departments, building relationships and demonstrating expertise that nobody in senior management had recognized or acknowledged. Her phone buzzed with an email notification, and Margaret glanced at the screen to see a message from Harold's assistant. Please plan to attend a department head meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. to discuss organizational restructuring and new reporting relationships. Sarah Martinez will be presenting the strategic framework for operational improvements. Sarah Martinez will be presenting. Not consulting on Margaret's presentation. Not providing administrative support for someone else's strategic initiatives, but taking the lead on high-level organizational planning. The email represented more than just a schedule change. It was official notification that the corporate hierarchy had shifted in ways that would be announced to senior staff within 24 hours. Margaret set down her phone and looked out at the workspace again, this time focusing on Sarah's position near the central conference room. She was reviewing documents with Jessica from marketing and 2 people from customer service, pointing to specific sections of what appeared to be a comprehensive operational analysis. The same kind of detailed strategic review that Margaret had been presenting to executive committees for years, except this one had clearly been developed independently by someone with deep understanding of cross-departmental workflows and efficiency optimization. The realization hit her with sudden force. Sarah hadn't been building expertise quietly over the past few years. She'd been operating at an executive level all along, conducting strategic analysis and developing operational improvements while maintaining the facade of an administrative support role. The consulting business, the military experience, the financial planning that enabled the ownership acquisition, all of it pointed to someone who'd been systematically preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity while letting others underestimate her capabilities. Margaret's intercom buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. "Ms. Sinclair?" Rachel's voice came through the speaker. "Sarah Martinez is here to see you. She says it's regarding tomorrow's department head meeting." For a moment, Margaret considered asking Rachel to schedule the meeting for later, buying herself time to process the morning's revelations and prepare for what was likely to be a challenging conversation. But delay would only postpone the inevitable, and she'd learned during her own corporate advancement that difficult conversations became more difficult the longer they were avoided. "Send her in," Margaret said, straightening her blazer and adopting the professional composure that had served her well during years of corporate negotiations and strategic discussions. Sarah entered the office carrying a different folder than the one she'd brought to Harold's meeting, this one thicker and marked with tabs that suggested comprehensive organizational analysis. She took the seat across from Margaret's desk without waiting to be invited, a subtle shift in protocol that reflected her new position in the company hierarchy. Sarah opened the folder and removed a document that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat, a comprehensive organizational chart with detailed annotations in Sarah's precise handwriting, showing not just current reporting structures, but proposed modifications that would fundamentally reshape how Meridian Technologies operated. Color-coded sections highlighted inefficiencies, redundancies, and opportunities for improvement that Margaret recognized immediately because she'd been struggling with many of the same operational challenges for months. "I wanted to discuss tomorrow's presentation with you before the department head meeting," Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd transitioned seamlessly from support staff to executive leadership in the span of a single morning. "Your insights will be valuable as we implement these changes." Margaret studied the organizational chart, noting how Sarah had identified bottlenecks in approval processes, communication gaps between departments, and resource allocation issues that had been hampering productivity across multiple divisions. The analysis was thorough, sophisticated, and uncomfortably accurate in its assessment of problems that Margaret had been aware of, but hadn't known how to address effectively. "This is quite comprehensive," Margaret said carefully, buying time to process the scope of what Sarah had developed. "How long have you been working on this restructuring proposal?" "About 18 months, Sarah replied without hesitation. "I started documenting patterns after the Henderson Industries project ran 6 weeks over schedule due to coordination issues between marketing, operations, and customer service. It became clear that our current structure was creating unnecessary delays and increasing costs." 18 months. Margaret felt a familiar chill as she realized that Sarah had been conducting strategic organizational analysis for a year and a half, while Margaret had been focused on quarterly presentations and board meeting preparations. The Henderson Industries delay had been a significant embarrassment for the company, requiring Margaret to explain to Harold why a routine implementation had become a costly overrun with unhappy clients. The root cause analysis showed that decision-making authority was unclear at several critical junctions, Sarah continued, pointing to specific sections of the organizational chart. Team members were waiting for approvals that could have been handled at lower levels, while other decisions were being made without appropriate oversight from people with relevant expertise. Margaret recognized the diplomatic language Sarah was using to describe what amounted to systematic management failures. The Henderson project had indeed suffered from unclear authority structures and poor communication between departments, but Margaret had attributed those problems to individual performance issues rather than systemic organizational design flaws. "What kind of modifications are you proposing?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would be more comprehensive than she was prepared to handle. Sarah flipped to the next page, revealing a proposed structure that streamlined reporting relationships, eliminated redundant approval processes, and created clear accountability for cross-departmental projects. The modifications weren't radical restructuring that would disrupt established workflows, but rather surgical improvements that addressed specific inefficiencies while maintaining operational stability. The key changes involve establishing project management protocols that give team leaders authority to make routine decisions without escalating to department heads, Sarah explained. "We'd also create liaison positions between departments to facilitate communication and prevent the kind of coordination failures that delayed the Henderson implementation." Margaret found herself nodding despite her emotional turmoil. The proposals made strategic sense, addressing problems she'd been wrestling with for months without finding effective solutions. Sarah had clearly thought through implementation challenges, resource requirements, and potential resistance from employees who were comfortable with existing procedures. "What about budget implications?" Margaret asked, falling into the familiar rhythm of executive consultation, despite the surreal circumstances of discussing organizational restructuring with someone who'd been her subordinate that morning. "The efficiency improvements should generate cost savings that more than offset implementation expenses," Sarah said, pulling out a financial analysis that showed projected returns on investment for each proposed modification. "The liaison positions can be filled through internal promotions, and the streamlined approval processes should reduce project completion times by approximately 15%. The financial projections were detailed and realistic, based on careful analysis of current operational costs and historically documented inefficiencies. Margaret realized that Sarah had been conducting the kind of comprehensive strategic planning that formed the foundation of successful organizational change, while maintaining her regular administrative responsibilities without anyone noticing the scope of her additional work. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sarah said, her tone shifting slightly to indicate they were moving from strategic planning to personnel matters. "Your role in the new organizational structure." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This was the conversation she'd been dreading since the moment Harold announced Sarah's ownership stake. Her position as operational director had been built on relationships, institutional knowledge, and strategic oversight that might not translate directly to the new hierarchy Sarah was proposing. "I've been thinking about how to best utilize your experience and expertise," Sarah continued. "You understand the executive interface better than anyone else in the company, and you have relationships with key clients that are valuable assets for Meridian." The phrasing was respectful but clear. Margaret's value lay in her existing relationships and institutional knowledge, rather than her strategic planning capabilities or operational oversight. She was being repositioned as a relationship manager and organizational historian, rather than a strategic decision-maker. I'm proposing that you take on a new role as Director of Client Relations and Strategic Partnerships, Sarah said, producing another document that outlined responsibilities Margaret hadn't expected. You'd be responsible for maintaining relationships with our major accounts, identifying expansion opportunities, and serving as the primary interface between executive leadership and external stakeholders. Margaret reviewed the job description with mixed emotions. The role Sarah was proposing carried significant prestige and responsibility, involving high-level client interactions and strategic partnership development that would showcase her relationship-building skills and industry knowledge. But it also represented a lateral move away from internal operational control toward external relationship management. The compensation package includes equity participation and performance bonuses tied to client retention and new business development, Sarah added. It's actually a more lucrative arrangement than your current position, with opportunities for growth as we expand our client base and develop new market segments. Margaret looked up from the documents, studying Sarah's expression for any hint of vindictiveness or calculated revenge for years of dismissive treatment. But she saw only professional consideration and genuine respect for her capabilities, even if those capabilities were being redirected rather than eliminated. "You're offering me a promotion," Margaret said slowly, testing the words to see if they sounded as strange spoken aloud as they felt in her mind. "I'm offering you a position that matches your strengths and maximizes your value to the company," Sarah corrected gently. Client relationship management requires exactly the kind of interpersonal skills and strategic thinking you've demonstrated during your time here. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The woman she'd publicly categorized as permanent support staff was now offering her career advancement opportunities that recognized her actual competencies rather than simply maintaining existing hierarchical structures. Sarah was demonstrating exactly the kind of strategic leadership and personnel management that Margaret had claimed to possess, but apparently hadn't developed as effectively as she'd believed. The story behind Sarah's transformation began 3 years earlier, on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening when she'd stayed late to finish quarterly expense reports that nobody else wanted to handle. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew and the distant hum of servers in the IT department, creating the kind of solitude that invited deeper thinking about career trajectories and professional satisfaction. She'd been sitting at her desk, reviewing vendor contracts for routine services like office supplies and equipment maintenance, when she noticed patterns that didn't make sense from a cost-efficiency perspective. Multiple vendors providing similar services at different price points, contract renewal dates scattered throughout the year instead of consolidated for better negotiating leverage, and service agreements that hadn't been reviewed for competitive pricing in several years. The inefficiencies weren't dramatic enough to trigger immediate attention from executive management, but they represented the kind of systematic waste that could accumulate into significant costs over time. Sarah pulled up spreadsheets and began calculating actual expenses versus market rates for comparable services, working until nearly midnight to develop a comprehensive analysis of potential savings opportunities. That analysis became her first real strategic document, though she didn't think of it in those terms at the time. She simply saw problems that could be solved and took the initiative to research solutions, drawing on the same systematic approach she'd used in the Army when tasked with optimizing supply chain logistics for overseas operations. The military experience had taught her to see organizational structures as interconnected systems, where small inefficiencies could cascade into major operational problems. In Afghanistan, she'd managed supply distribution for 3 forward operating bases, coordinating everything from ammunition delivery to medical supplies while maintaining detailed records that allowed her commanders to track resource allocation and identify potential shortages before they became critical. Those skills translated directly to corporate operations, though it took time for Sarah to recognize the parallels between military logistics and business process optimization. The same analytical methods that helped her streamline equipment procurement for combat units could identify bottlenecks in customer service workflows or redundancies in administrative procedures. Her consulting business had started almost by accident when a college friend mentioned that her employer was struggling with operational inefficiencies similar to what Sarah had identified at Meridian. Sarah offered to review their processes during a weekend visit, producing a brief analysis that identified several improvement opportunities. When those recommendations resulted in measurable cost savings, word spread through professional networks about a veteran who understood operational optimization. The consulting work provided 2 crucial advantages: external perspective on industry best practices, and additional income that could be invested rather than spent on lifestyle improvements. Sarah had learned financial discipline during military service, when steady pay and limited spending opportunities made it possible to save significant percentages of her income. She applied the same approach to her civilian career, living modestly while building investment portfolios that could eventually provide financial independence. The SBA veteran loan programs opened possibilities she hadn't initially considered. Low-interest financing for business development and investment opportunities, combined with her consulting income and accumulated savings, created pathways to ownership stakes that weren't available through traditional corporate advancement. She began studying business acquisition strategies, working with financial advisors who specialized in veteran entrepreneurship and small business development. Harold Winters had been the key to making ownership acquisition possible at Meridian specifically. Sarah had been observing him for years, noting his frustration with operational inefficiencies and his growing concerns about succession planning as he approached retirement age. He valued strategic thinking and systematic problem-solving, but he also understood that effective leadership required more than just analytical skills. The breakthrough came during a casual conversation after a company holiday party, when Harold mentioned his disappointment that younger employees seemed focused on advancement opportunities rather than operational excellence. Sarah had listened carefully, recognizing an opening to demonstrate that some people were motivated by organizational success rather than personal recognition. She began leaving strategic analyses on his desk, always presented as informal observations rather than formal recommendations. Market research that identified new business development opportunities. Operational assessments that highlighted efficiency improvements. Competitive analyses that suggested strategic partnerships or service expansions. Each document was carefully crafted to demonstrate strategic thinking while maintaining her position as a supportive administrative professional. Harold's response had been gradual but positive. He began asking Sarah's opinion about operational matters during casual encounters in the hallway or break room. He requested her input on vendor evaluations and project timelines. Eventually, he started scheduling brief, informal meetings to discuss strategic initiatives, treating her as a trusted advisor rather than simply an administrative employee. The ownership conversation began 6 months ago, when Harold mentioned his interest in identifying internal candidates for increased responsibility and equity participation. Sarah had waited 2 weeks before approaching him with a carefully prepared proposal that outlined her qualifications, financial capacity, and vision for operational improvements that could position Meridian for sustainable growth. The negotiation process had been complex, involving legal reviews, financial audits, and strategic planning sessions that stretched over several months. Sarah worked with attorneys who specialized in business acquisitions, financial advisors who understood veteran loan programs, and operational consultants who helped her develop comprehensive plans for organizational improvements. Throughout the entire process, she maintained her regular administrative responsibilities while building the external relationships and financial resources that would make ownership acquisition possible. The dual existence required careful time management and absolute discretion, since premature disclosure could have undermined the acquisition strategy or created workplace conflicts that would complicate the transition. Margaret's dismissive comments at the corporate retreat had been particularly painful because they came just days before the final ownership paperwork was scheduled for completion. Sarah had spent months preparing for this transition, working with Harold to develop implementation strategies that would minimize disruption while maximizing operational improvements. To be publicly categorized as permanent support staff when she was about to become a major stakeholder felt like a final insult before vindication. But the military had taught her patience and strategic thinking that extended beyond immediate emotional responses. Margaret's comments reflected ignorance rather than malice, and successful organizational leadership required the ability to work effectively with people who might initially resist change or fail to understand new authority structures. The key was focusing on operational excellence and strategic results, rather than personal recognition or emotional satisfaction. Sarah had learned that effective leadership meant creating conditions for organizational success, even when that required working with people who had previously underestimated her capabilities or dismissed her contributions. Now, sitting across from Margaret in the office where she'd spent countless hours being treated as a competent but limited administrative professional, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with actual authority to implement the changes she'd been analyzing and planning for years. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down the organizational charts and personnel documents that Sarah had presented with such calm professionalism. The weight of everything that had transpired in the past few hours was finally settling into her consciousness like sediment in disturbed water, and she needed to have a conversation that she'd been avoiding since the moment Harold announced Sarah's ownership stake. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized her interactions with Sarah for 8 years. "What I said at the retreat yesterday was inappropriate and unprofessional. I made assumptions about your capabilities and career trajectory that were clearly wrong." Sarah looked up from organizing her documents, studying Margaret's expression with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was assessing the sincerity of the apology, rather than simply accepting it at face value. The silence stretched between them for several seconds, filled with the weight of years of dismissive comments, overlooked contributions, and systematic underestimation that had defined their professional relationship. "I appreciate you saying that," Sarah replied finally, though her tone remained neutral rather than warm. "But I think we need to discuss more than just yesterday's comments. There's a pattern of behavior here that goes back years, and we can't move forward effectively without acknowledging that reality." Margaret felt heat creep up her neck as she recognized the uncomfortable truth in Sarah's words. The retreat incident wasn't an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was simply the most public example of an attitude that had shaped every interaction between them since Sarah had started at Meridian Technologies. "You're right," Margaret said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the discomfort of having her professional conduct examined so directly. "I've consistently undervalued your contributions and failed to recognize your potential for strategic leadership. That's on me, and it's affected not just our working relationship, but the company's ability to utilize your skills effectively." Sarah nodded slowly, acknowledging the admission without offering immediate forgiveness or reassurance that everything could be smoothed over with a simple apology. Her military background had apparently taught her the difference between genuine accountability and perfunctory damage control, and she wasn't going to make this conversation easier for Margaret by pretending the issues were less significant than they actually were. "What I don't understand," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair, "is how someone with your experience in corporate management could consistently miss the strategic work I was doing. The operational analyses, the vendor evaluations, the process improvements, none of that happened invisibly. You saw the results. You incorporated the recommendations into your own presentations. How did you rationalize that disconnect?" The question hit Margaret like cold water, forcing her to confront the cognitive mechanisms she'd used to maintain her assumptions about Sarah's capabilities while benefiting from her strategic insights. It was easier to think of Sarah as a helpful administrative professional who occasionally offered useful observations than to acknowledge that she was conducting executive-level analysis while receiving administrative-level recognition and compensation. "I think I saw what I expected to see," Margaret said slowly, trying to articulate thought processes that she'd never examined critically before. "Sarah Martinez, administrative support, helpful with details and routine analysis. It was easier to fit your contributions into that framework than to question whether the framework itself was accurate. Even when my routine analysis consistently identified problems and solutions that improved operational efficiency and saved the company money," Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of steel underneath that reminded Margaret she was no longer speaking to someone who had to accept dismissive treatment without response. Margaret winced at the implication. She'd built her reputation for strategic insight partly on recommendations that had originated from Sarah's analyses, presenting them to executive committees, and taking credit for improvements that she hadn't actually developed. The ethical implications of that pattern were becoming uncomfortably clear now that she was forced to examine them directly. "I convinced myself that I was synthesizing input from multiple sources into coherent strategic recommendations," Margaret said, though the words sounded hollow even as she spoke them. "But that's not really what happened, is it? I was taking your analyses and presenting them as my own strategic thinking." "No, that's not what happened," Sarah said firmly. What happened was that you consistently failed to give appropriate credit for strategic contributions while positioning yourself as the source of operational insights that you didn't actually develop. That's not synthesis, that's appropriation. The accusation hung in the air between them, impossible to deny and uncomfortable to acknowledge. Margaret had spent years building her professional identity around strategic operational management, never questioning whether her insights were genuinely her own or borrowed from sources she'd failed to recognize properly. You could have exposed that pattern at any time, Margaret said, though she wasn't sure if she was making an observation or an accusation. You had documentation, email trails, meeting notes that would have shown the real source of those recommendations. Why didn't you ever challenge the misattribution? Sarah's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been amusement or possibly pity. Because challenging you publicly would have required me to become the kind of person who fights for recognition and credit instead of focusing on results. I was more interested in building operational excellence than in winning corporate politics battles. But you were building something else too, Margaret said, beginning to understand the long-term strategy that had been invisible to her until this morning. The consulting business, the financial investments, the relationship with Harold. You were creating alternatives to traditional advancement pathways. I was creating independence, Sarah corrected, the ability to contribute at the level of my actual capabilities rather than being limited by other people's perceptions of what I could accomplish. Traditional advancement would have required playing games I wasn't interested in playing and waiting for recognition from people who had already demonstrated they couldn't see past their own assumptions. Margaret felt a strange mixture of respect and regret as she absorbed the implications of Sarah's approach. While she'd been focused on climbing existing hierarchical structures and competing for recognition within established corporate frameworks, Sarah had been building parallel systems that gave her control over her own professional trajectory. Is ownership acquisition always the goal? Margaret asked. Not initially, Sarah said. Initially, I just wanted to do good work and be recognized appropriately for strategic contributions. But after years of watching my analyses get absorbed into other people's presentations, I realized that recognition within existing structures wasn't going to happen. So I started building external resources that would give me authority to implement improvements directly, rather than hoping someone else would give me appropriate credit. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on Margaret's office door. Rachel peered in with the expression of someone who wasn't sure whether she was interrupting something important. Ms. Sinclair, the 3 o'clock meeting with procurement is here. Should I ask them to wait? Margaret looked at Sarah, who was already standing and collecting her documents with the efficient movements of someone whose time was now significantly more valuable than it had been that morning. We can continue this conversation later, Sarah said. Right now, I need to prepare for tomorrow's department head meeting. But Margaret, this discussion isn't finished. We have more to work through if we're going to collaborate effectively going forward. The department head meeting took place in Meridian's largest conference room, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Portland skyline and a polished mahogany table that could seat 20 people comfortably. Margaret arrived early, claiming her usual seat near the head of the table where she'd presented countless strategic initiatives over the years, but this morning felt different. She was attending as a participant rather than a presenter, waiting to hear someone else outline the future direction of operational improvements she'd thought were her responsibility. Harold entered at exactly 10 o'clock, followed by department heads from marketing, operations, customer service, and information technology. The usual pre-meeting conversations about weekend plans and quarterly targets felt subdued, as if everyone sensed that significant announcements were coming without knowing exactly what to expect. Sarah arrived last, carrying a leather portfolio that replaced her familiar manila folders, and wearing a charcoal gray blazer that somehow made her look taller and more commanding than Margaret had ever noticed before. She took the seat to Harold's right, the position traditionally reserved for the highest-ranking operational executive, without hesitation or self-consciousness. Thank you all for being here, Harold began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for important organizational announcements. We're here to discuss some significant changes in leadership structure and operational oversight that will take effect immediately. Margaret watched the faces around the table as Harold's words registered. David from operations looked confused but attentive. Jessica from marketing glanced between Harold and Sarah with growing awareness that something major was happening. Tom Chen from product management had the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Effective today, Sarah Martinez has acquired a 43% ownership stake in Meridian Technologies, making her our largest minority shareholder and giving her authority over strategic operational decisions. Harold continued. Sarah will be taking the lead on organizational restructuring initiatives and efficiency improvements that we've been discussing for several months. The silence that followed was different from the polite attention that usually greeted Harold's announcements. This was the silence of people processing information that fundamentally altered their understanding of corporate hierarchy and reporting relationships. Margaret could see the moment when each department head realized that Sarah Martinez, who many of them had interacted with as administrative support, was now their organizational superior. "I know this comes as a surprise," Sarah said, rising to address the group with calm authority. "I'd like to take a few minutes to outline the strategic vision behind these changes and explain how they'll affect daily operations and departmental coordination." She moved to the presentation screen with the same quiet efficiency she'd always displayed, but now her movements carried the weight of genuine authority rather than supportive assistance. The slides she displayed showed comprehensive organizational charts, efficiency metrics, and implementation timelines that demonstrated months of strategic planning. The primary goal is operational excellence through streamlined decision-making and improved cross-departmental communication, Sarah explained, clicking through slides that showed current workflow bottlenecks and proposed solutions. "We've identified several areas where unclear authority structures and redundant approval processes are creating delays and increasing costs." Margaret recognized many of the improvements Sarah was presenting. They were refinements and expansions of the operational analyses she'd been seeing in various forms for months. But now she understood that these weren't random suggestions from a helpful administrative employee. They were components of a comprehensive strategic vision that Sarah had been developing systematically while maintaining her public role as support staff. "Questions about implementation timeline or resource requirements?" Sarah asked, scanning the faces around the table with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to leading strategic discussions. David from operations raised his hand tentatively. "Sarah, I've been hoping we could move forward with some of these workflow improvements for months. Will you have authority to approve implementation without going through the usual committee review process?" "Yes," Sarah replied without hesitation. "These organizational changes include streamlined approval authority for operational improvements that fall within established budget parameters. We'll be able to implement efficiency measures more quickly while maintaining appropriate oversight for major strategic decisions." Margaret felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched Sarah field questions with the kind of detailed knowledge and strategic understanding that had taken Margaret years to develop. Pride in seeing someone she'd worked with demonstrate such competence, regret for not recognizing that competence earlier, and concern about her own position in the new organizational structure that Sarah was describing. Margaret will be transitioning to a new role as Director of Client Relations and Strategic Partnerships, Harold announced, bringing attention to her end of the table. Her experience with executive-level client interactions and industry relationships will be valuable as we expand our business development initiatives. The announcement was delivered matter-of-factly, but Margaret could see the careful attention it received from her colleagues. They understood that she was being repositioned rather than promoted, moved from internal operational oversight to external relationship management. It was a lateral transition that preserved her seniority while acknowledging that strategic operational authority was shifting to someone else. "The transition process will be collaborative," Sarah added, looking directly at Margaret with an expression that suggested professional respect rather than vindictive satisfaction. Margaret's institutional knowledge and client relationships are valuable assets that will inform our strategic planning and business development efforts. After the meeting concluded and department heads began filtering out with the distracted expressions of people adjusting to significant organizational changes, Margaret found herself walking alongside Tom Chen toward the elevator bank. He'd been quiet during the presentation, taking detailed notes but asking a few questions. "That was unexpected," Tom said once they were alone in the hallway. "I mean, I knew Sarah was sharp, but I didn't realize she'd been conducting that level of strategic analysis." "None of us did," Margaret replied, and for the first time since yesterday's retreat, she felt able to acknowledge that reality without defensiveness or embarrassment. "She's apparently been working at an executive level, while the rest of us assumed she was providing administrative support." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Makes me wonder what other assumptions we've been making about people's capabilities based on their job titles, rather than their actual contributions." The observation hit closer to home than Tom probably intended. Margaret had built her corporate advancement on the assumption that strategic thinking and operational expertise were clearly visible and appropriately recognized within organizational structures. The idea that someone could be conducting executive-level work while being systematically overlooked challenged fundamental beliefs about how corporate hierarchies identified and developed talent. As the elevator doors closed behind them, Margaret reflected on how dramatically her professional world had shifted in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she'd been a senior operational executive with clear authority and established responsibilities. Today, she was transitioning to a new role under the authority of someone she'd publicly dismissed as permanently relegated to support functions. But perhaps most significantly, she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about corporate recognition and advancement had been fundamentally flawed. Sarah's success hadn't come from playing traditional political games or seeking validation from existing authority structures. It came from building competence, developing resources, and creating opportunities that didn't depend on other people's perceptions or approval. The future felt uncertain in ways that were both threatening and potentially liberating, as Margaret realized that her own professional trajectory might benefit from examining the strategic approach that had allowed Sarah Martinez to transform from overlooked support staff to company owner while everyone else remained focused on conventional measures of corporate success. 3 weeks after the department head meeting, the ripple effects of Sarah's ownership acquisition had spread throughout Meridian Technologies in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. The company's operational efficiency had improved measurably as Sarah implemented the streamlined approval processes she'd been analyzing for months, but the cultural shifts were proving more complex and far-reaching than simple organizational restructuring. In the customer service department, Jessica Williams found herself in conversations about process improvements that she'd never had access to before. Sarah had established weekly cross-departmental meetings where frontline employees could raise operational concerns directly with executive leadership, bypassing the traditional hierarchy that had filtered suggestions through multiple layers of management approval. "I've been tracking customer complaint patterns for 2 years," Jessica explained during one of these sessions, presenting data that showed recurring issues with product delivery coordination. "The problems aren't random. They follow predictable patterns based on seasonal demand and vendor capacity limitations." Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that operational insights could come from any level of the organization, not just senior management presentations. She asked detailed questions about Jessica's tracking methods, data sources, and proposed solutions, treating the conversation as a strategic consultation rather than a routine feedback session. "Have you discussed these patterns with the operations team?" Sarah asked, taking notes on Jessica's analysis with the same care she'd once applied to military logistics coordination. "I tried, but the suggestion got lost somewhere between my supervisor and department management," Jessica replied with a slight shrug. "I eventually stopped bringing it up because it didn't seem like anyone was interested in input from customer service representatives." The comment highlighted exactly the kind of communication breakdown that Sarah's organizational restructuring was designed to address. Valuable operational intelligence was being generated throughout the company but never reaching decision-makers who could act on it effectively. Sarah made a note to review communication protocols between customer service and operations, recognizing that this was probably one example of many similar disconnects. Margaret observed these changes from her new position as Director of Client Relations, where she was discovering that external relationship management required different skills than internal operational oversight. Her first major assignment involved renegotiating service agreements with 3 key clients whose contracts were up for renewal, a process that demanded deep understanding of client needs and market competitive dynamics. The work was challenging in ways Margaret hadn't expected. Instead of making decisions about internal resource allocation and workflow optimization, She was learning to navigate complex negotiations where Meridian's interests had to be balanced against client demands and competitive pressures. The strategic thinking was similar to her previous responsibilities, but the execution required different expertise and relationship management approaches. The Henderson Industries renewal is more complicated than we initially assessed, Margaret reported during her first monthly review with Sarah and Harold. They're satisfied with service delivery, but they're receiving competitive proposals that include additional features we don't currently offer. Sarah listened to Margaret's analysis with professional attention, asking clarifying questions about specific client requirements and competitive positioning. The dynamic between them had evolved into something approaching genuine collaboration, though both women remained careful about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries given their complicated history. What kind of additional features are competitors proposing? Sarah asked, pulling up client files on her tablet to review service history and performance metrics. Primarily enhanced analytics and reporting capabilities that would give Henderson better visibility into operational performance, Margaret explained. They're not necessarily looking to change providers, but they want assurance that we can match evolving industry standards. The conversation represented exactly the kind of strategic problem-solving that Sarah had been hoping to encourage through organizational restructuring. Margaret was identifying market intelligence that could inform both client retention strategies and broader business development initiatives, while Sarah was positioned to make decisions about resource allocation and capability development that could address competitive challenges. Harold, who had been quietly observing the interaction between his two senior executives, interjected with a question that revealed his satisfaction with how the transition was progressing. Do we have internal capability to develop those enhanced analytics features, or would we need external partnerships? Internal development is possible but would require significant IT resources and potentially 6 months for full implementation, Sarah replied, clearly having already considered the technical aspects of Henderson's requirements. External partnerships could provide faster implementation but might create dependency relationships that could complicate future client negotiations. Margaret found herself impressed by the depth of Sarah's analysis, which demonstrated not just technical understanding but strategic thinking about long-term implications of different solution approaches. This was executive-level decision-making that considered multiple variables and potential consequences, rather than simply addressing immediate client demands. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, covering client retention strategies, competitive positioning, and resource allocation priorities that would inform quarterly planning decisions. Margaret realized that she was participating in exactly the kind of high-level strategic discussion she'd always enjoyed, but with a clearer understanding of her role and contributions within the broader organizational framework. Tom Chen had been experiencing his own adjustment to the new operational structure, finding that Sarah's streamlined approval processes made it possible to implement product improvements that had been stalled in bureaucratic review cycles for months. Projects that previously required multiple committee approvals and extensive documentation could now be authorized through direct consultation with relevant department heads and strategic oversight from Sarah. The development timeline for the client portal enhancement just got compressed from 4 months to 6 weeks, Tom reported to his team during their weekly planning meeting. Sarah approved the resource allocation and removed the approval bottlenecks that were slowing down implementation. His team members exchanged glances that suggested they were still adjusting to the reality that major strategic decisions were being made more quickly and efficiently than they'd experienced during their tenure at Meridian. The change wasn't just administrative. It represented a fundamental shift in how the company operated and how quickly they could respond to market opportunities. But the most significant ripple effect was emerging in the company's external reputation within Portland's technology community. Word had spread through professional networks that Meridian Technologies had undergone major leadership changes involving a veteran business owner who'd acquired a significant ownership stake through strategic financial planning, rather than traditional corporate advancement. Sarah began receiving invitations to speak at veteran business organizations and technology industry conferences about operational efficiency and strategic business development. Her consulting background and military experience, combined with her successful ownership acquisition, made her an interesting case study for other veterans considering entrepreneurship and business investment strategies. The external recognition was validating in ways that internal corporate advancement had never been, providing Sarah with professional credibility that extended far beyond Meridian's organizational boundaries. She was being recognized as a strategic business leader rather than someone who'd been promoted beyond her apparent qualifications, a distinction that reflected the difference between earned authority and inherited position. 6 months after the ownership transfer, Sarah stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new corner office on the 20th floor, watching the Portland skyline transform under the soft light of a Pacific Northwest autumn evening. The space had been redesigned to reflect her leadership style, functional rather than ostentatious, with work areas optimized for collaborative meetings and strategic planning, rather than impressive displays of corporate authority. The transition had been smoother than anyone had anticipated, largely because Sarah's approach to leadership emphasized operational excellence over personal recognition. She'd implemented the efficiency improvements gradually, allowing employees to adapt to new procedures without feeling overwhelmed by sudden organizational upheaval. The company's quarterly performance had improved measurably, with cost savings and productivity gains that impressed both Harold and the board of directors. Margaret knocked softly on the office door, carrying a portfolio of client renewal agreements that represented her most successful quarter since transitioning to external relationship management. The Henderson Industries contract had been renewed with enhanced service provisions that strengthened Meridian's competitive position, and 2 additional major clients had signed expansion agreements that would significantly increase revenue over the next fiscal year. "The quarterly results are impressive," Margaret said, settling into one of the chairs arranged around Sarah's conference table. "Client retention is at 94%, and new business development is ahead of projections by 23%. Sarah reviewed the financial summaries with the careful attention she brought to all operational analyses, noting patterns in client satisfaction metrics and market positioning that would inform strategic planning for the coming year. The external relationship management approach was proving successful beyond initial expectations, generating not just contract renewals but referral business from satisfied clients who recommended Meridian's services to other companies. "The referral patterns suggest we're building a reputation for reliability and strategic partnership rather than just technical competence," Sarah observed, highlighting specific client feedback that emphasized Meridian's understanding of business needs beyond simple service delivery. "That's valuable market differentiation that should support premium pricing strategies." The conversation represented the kind of collaborative strategic analysis that had become typical of their working relationship. Margaret's expertise in client relationship management complemented Sarah's operational oversight, creating synergies that neither woman had anticipated when the organizational restructuring was first implemented. "There's something else we should discuss," Margaret said, her tone shifting to indicate she was moving from routine business reporting to more sensitive topics. "I've been thinking about our conversation 6 months ago, about recognition and career development patterns within corporate structures." Sarah looked up from the financial reports, giving Margaret her full attention with the patient focus that had become characteristic of her leadership approach. The relationship between them had evolved from supervisor-subordinate hierarchy to professional collaboration. But both women understood that their complicated history required ongoing attention and honest communication. "I've learned things about business development and strategic partnership management that I never would have discovered if I'd remained focused on internal operational control," Margaret continued. "The external perspective has been valuable in ways I didn't expect, and I think I'm contributing more effectively to the company's success than I was in my previous role." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that Margaret was offering something more significant than routine job satisfaction feedback. This was acknowledgement that the organizational restructuring had created opportunities for both personal and professional growth that wouldn't have been possible under the previous hierarchy. "What specifically has been most valuable about the external focus?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about Margaret's experience with client relationship management and business development responsibilities. "Understanding how our operational efficiency translates into competitive advantages that clients actually care about," Margaret replied. "Internal operations can become insular if you're only focused on workflow optimization and cost reduction. But when you're negotiating with clients who have choices about service providers, you develop a much clearer perspective on what operational excellence actually means in market terms." The insight was strategically valuable beyond Margaret's personal professional development. Sarah made notes about how client feedback could inform operational priorities, recognizing that external market validation provided objective measures of organizational effectiveness that internal metrics might miss. Harold appeared in the doorway, carrying a manila folder that Sarah immediately recognized as containing board meeting materials. His expression suggested satisfaction with whatever quarterly results and strategic updates he'd been reviewing in preparation for the upcoming board presentation. "I wanted to discuss the expansion proposal before tomorrow's board meeting," Harold said, taking a seat at the conference table and opening the folder to reveal financial projections and market analysis documents. "The numbers look compelling, but I'd like your assessment of operational readiness for additional client capacity." Sarah had been developing the expansion strategy for 2 months, analyzing market opportunities in Seattle and San Francisco that could leverage Meridian's operational expertise while providing geographic diversification that would reduce dependency on Portland area clients. The proposal involved establishing satellite offices with local relationship managers while maintaining centralized operational support from the Portland headquarters. "Operational capacity isn't the limiting factor," Sarah replied, pulling up implementation timelines on her tablet. "We've streamlined processes enough to handle 30% additional client volume without proportional increases in operational staff. The key challenges are market entry strategies and competitive positioning in markets where we don't have established relationships." Margaret leaned forward with interest, recognizing that geographic expansion would create significant opportunities for her client relationship expertise. "The Seattle market particularly has several potential clients I've been tracking through industry networks. Companies that are dissatisfied with current service providers but haven't found alternatives that meet their specific requirements." The conversation that followed demonstrated exactly the kind of collaborative strategic planning that Sarah had envisioned when she'd first begun analyzing organizational inefficiencies 3 years earlier. Harold provided historical perspective and board-level guidance, Margaret contributing market intelligence and relationship management expertise, and Sarah coordinating operational analysis that could support informed decision-making about resource allocation and risk management. "The board will want to understand implementation timelines and expected return on investment," Harold said, reviewing financial projections that showed conservative estimates for revenue growth and market penetration over a 2-year period. "Conservative projections show break-even within 18 months, with significant profitability by the end of year 2, Sarah explained, displaying charts that showed multiple scenarios based on different market penetration rates and competitive responses. "The operational infrastructure can support expansion without major capital investments, so the primary risks are market-related rather than operational." As the meeting concluded and Harold left to finalize board presentation materials, Sarah and Margaret remained at the conference table, reviewing client data and market analysis that would support the expansion strategy. The collaborative dynamic between them had become natural and productive, focused on strategic problem-solving rather than hierarchical positioning or historical grievances. "It's interesting how different this feels from the corporate advancement strategies I used to focus on," Margaret said, organizing client files with the same methodical attention she'd always brought to administrative tasks. "Building something sustainable and strategically valuable versus competing for recognition within existing structures," Sarah smiled, recognizing the wisdom in Margaret's observation. The ownership acquisition had provided authority to implement strategic improvements, but the real satisfaction came from seeing organizational excellence translate into measurable business success that benefited employees, clients, and stakeholders, rather than just individual career advancement. Outside the office windows, Portland's skyline glittered with the lights of other companies facing their own strategic challenges and opportunities. But inside Meridian Technologies, Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction of having built something worth leading, surrounded by colleagues who understood that sustainable success came from operational excellence rather than corporate politics or personal recognition. 1 year later, Sarah received an invitation that made her pause mid-sip of her morning coffee. The Portland Business Journal was hosting their annual Women in Leadership Awards ceremony, and Margaret Sinclair had nominated her for Executive of the Year, with a nomination letter that began, "Sarah Martinez represents the kind of strategic leadership that transforms organizations not through self-promotion, but through quiet excellence and systematic improvement." The irony wasn't lost on either of them when they attended the ceremony together, Sarah as the nominee and Margaret as her nominator. During the cocktail reception, They overheard familiar conversations about corporate advancement, networking strategies, and the challenges of being recognized in male-dominated industries. "You know what I've learned?" Margaret said quietly as they watched other attendees exchange business cards and LinkedIn connections. "The most powerful people in any room are usually the ones nobody's paying attention to." Sarah nodded, thinking about the evening when she'd worked late analyzing vendor contracts while everyone else focused on visible career positioning. Sometimes the best strategy is becoming indispensable before anyone realizes what you're building. Whether Sarah won the award that night wasn't important. What mattered was sitting in an audience where her military service, strategic thinking, and business ownership were recognized as valuable leadership qualities rather than surprising exceptions to expectations about administrative professionals. The real victory had happened months earlier, in a conference room where someone called just a secretary became the person responsible for shaping the future direction of an entire organization. What did you think of Sarah's journey from dismissed secretary to company owner? Have you ever been underestimated at work, or witnessed someone's hidden talents finally get the recognition they deserved? Share your own workplace transformation stories in the comments below. I love hearing about people who proved their doubters wrong through strategic planning and quiet determination. If you enjoyed this story of professional resilience and strategic career building, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. I share new inspirational stories every week about people who turned underestimation into unstoppable success. What story should I tell next? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Your idea might become next week's video.